I think that we're just at the beginnings of the biology of consciousness. I think that within 20 years, if we don't blow ourselves up, that we may have a radically deeper view of human nature.
As soon as they be born, speaking lies, calling himself Christ, telling that, oh, Christopher Columbus discovered America. Christopher Columbus died of syphilis. He was also a faggot. He believed in bestiality, just like all you so-called white people. Okay? How the hell they gonna teach in school Christopher Columbus discovered America when they're Indians? The so-called Indians, the Gadites, was here first. Y'all liars, man. Y'all liars and the father of it. Give me John 8:44. This so-called white boy walking up and down here, he ain't better than y'all. He ain't better than the so-called Negro, West Indian, Puerto Ricans, according to the Bible. Most I picked you. Read. Ye are of your father, the devil. You white boy, you are of the father, the devil. And you don't like it, that's too damn bad. There's nothing you can do about it.
In no particular order, we are greedy and egocentric. We cut down trees, we use fluorocarbons, we spoil the atmosphere. We think the earth has infinite resource. It doesn't. We're really running into the limited resources of the earth now. The other thing which horrifies me, I think, is, and there's such a danger in human nature, is fanaticism and terrorism. And when people are filled with fanatical anger, they treat themselves and others as non-human, as not even creatures. And there are no animal behaves as badly as we do. And this is the other side of our majestic science.
You white people are getting ready to go to court. You're getting ready to be tried, prosecuted, sentenced, and put in jail. That's right. You're going into slavery. I know you don't believe it, but guess what? It's graphically written all throughout the Bible, you dumb, stupid fools. The downfall of your economy, idiots, is in the Bible. You white people, about you losing your jobs, your homes, your bank accounts, that's in the Bible. You have no future. Your kids are not going to college no more. They can't go to college. Why? There's no grants for the college. There's no money. Your businesses are closing down. Why? Because your leaders have sold you out, dumb, stupid Europeans. This is your kingdom that's going out. You were supposed to enjoy the wealth of this kingdom just like the Rockefellers, just like the Kennedys, just like the Duplons. A society of rapists, robbers, muggers, and criminals. And you white people are the biggest criminals on this planet Earth.
Can I say a word about death?
Yes.
Yeah. I want to say that the other side and the tragic side to this wonderful uniqueness of each human being is that we are all mortal. I'm going tomorrow to the funeral of an old friend. Now he's gone, his place in the universe will never be filled. There was never a creature quite like him before. There will never be one quite like him again. This is now occasionally I lose or break a watch or the computer goes down, but clearly that doesn't affect me in the same way. I want to say that the other side of uniqueness, and this living uniqueness, is death and the unfillable gap which follows people's death.
Yes, on the one hand we seem to be the precious things of evolution. On the other hand we die as clumsy, wasteful, cruelly horrible as Darwin wrote, just as the bees and the horses.
Well, perhaps so, and Kierkegaard's last words were "sweep me up," and yet whatever biological death, we have all of us at some level found meaning and created meaning in our lives, and we hand this on. Even at the biological level, sort of animals become loam, they enrich the earth, and I think we certainly do so. It may be the only form of immortality we know.
Do you remember Hampstead Heath, wandering around? What that meant to you? Anything? Nothing? Were you immortal on your 12th?
It meant a playground. And yes, I think I did feel immortal when I was 12, and for that matter, probably through my 20s and 30s.
When did you get the feeling that you were not immortal?
Right. I was going to say, when I used to ride a motorbike, I was a rather dangerous rider. People say you behave as if you're immortal. I think after I almost died on the mountain.
In Norway?
In Norway. After I had fallen and badly injured my leg. I was at 5,000 feet. I was alone. No one knew where I was. I had no way of giving a signal. It was above the Arctic Circle. I would not have survived the night. I thought it unlikely that I would be found. But since then, I think especially, I think probably as one gets into one's 40s and 50s anyhow, you feel mortality, your friends are dying, you feel you yourself are not quite the man you used to be. But I think for me, a particular crisis was this episode in which death became so imaginable.
Can you remember you're there, the night is coming. What was it, fear? Was it, what did happen to you at these very moments?
There were many different sort of moods. One of them was a vivid, involuntary recollection of scenes from childhood, and
really,
and happy scenes from gardens, Hampstead Heath, family, friends.
Like in the books.
And it was in fact only when this was happening that I thought of a line from one of Auden's last poems, when he said, "Let your last thinks all be thanks." That I realized at some deep level I was preparing for dying. I had a sense of this sort of transfer from one generation to another. I thought how much I'd been given, and for myself I thought, well, perhaps I've given something to students and patients, and I thought perhaps I've written a couple of books which are worthwhile. Now clearly there were other feelings, and there was a sheer sort of animal fear of physical misery and agony, and beyond that I think the unimaginable metaphysical fear of not being. So it seemed to me not dying, but not being here. And I think along with this some sense that I think I was fretted by a feeling of work which hadn't been done, and as perhaps we all are. I don't know whether there's any appropriate time to die, but I'm glad I didn't die then.
No, not so clumsy, not so wasteful at that moment.
No.
But can't you imagine a time that you will say, well, now it's enough, because immortality is the real punishment, is the real hell, or...
With this clumsy, wasteful thing, when my mother died of a heart attack, I'm afraid my immediate thought was fucking plumbing.
Yeah.
I got annoyed at the notion, as it were, of a blocked artery putting the end to a human existence. It seemed to be sort of outrageous. Perhaps that was sort of like the Darwinian feeling. I have many aged patients in their 90s, sometimes in their hundreds, who sometimes say my life has been full, and many of them are religious. They say, Lord, I'm ready. Nunc dimittis. I can't quite imagine that. I'm sort of not ready at the moment. Though I don't know what would happen to me if I became ill with this poor friend of mine who is a sort of twin. We were born on the same day, and he was in the middle of some of his best ever work. He was a geneticist, and he got cancer of the stomach, which, this is it.
Just like that.
Just like that.
Ridiculous.
And I don't know how reconciled he was. He seemed to me at least to be deeply sad all the way through, although I think there was also a sort of resignation, as Dylan Thomas has this fight against the dying of the light, but then perhaps he was a man in his 30s or whatever when he wrote that. But then again, the aged Goethe in 85 called for light. That was his last word. The sort of death I like most is I like the idea of most is one which is related of Pavlov. Pavlov used to have these sudden tremendous bursts and hurricanes of energy and creativity, and when he would get the whole lab going and everyone was full of creative excitement and the world seemed to be created anew for him and them when these happened. And when he was very ill and turning and tossing in a final pneumonia delirium, his face suddenly changed and he cried, "To work!" with this wonderful creative look, and he fell back dead. And I think that's
your way of
I think that would be
passing.
Nice. I would hate to think of life without that sense of creativity and excitement ever again. I would feel it maybe wasn't worth it.
Realizing your friend dying, how short is life?
Well, it certainly doesn't have any sort of consistent duration for me. Sometimes it seems immensely long, and sometimes sort of no time at all. It is the disappearance of the familiar and the past which is difficult to get used to. On the whole, I'm excited by the new. And when someone asked me in an interview, they said, if like one of your patients, you were asleep or out of it for 30 years, and then came to in 2020, what's the first thing you'd want to do? And I said, I'd want to see the Scientific American. And I think I probably should have said my near and dear ones, but somehow, no, I'm especially excited by what's new in science. That pleases me very much, and things are, in neuroscience and physiology, are much more wonderful and exciting than they were 30 years ago. And I think when I have a sense of things opening there. But out through the window, when I first came to New York, one saw all the steamships there in their berths. I wish I'd paid more attention. I didn't realize it was these were the last days of the France, the Leonardo, the Queen's.
Episode of,
Yeah, I didn't realize it was the end of steam. It's very odd sometimes. I described the first car I had, or the first motorbike, and people say, but that was a museum piece. That's a museum piece. And then you say, well, am I a museum piece? Yes. Now, of course, in a way, we are not museum pieces so long as we are being updated all the while. One of the sort of tragedies of Rose was that she had become a museum piece. One of the strange things with the death of friends and with death generally is the image can no longer be updated. I especially feel this of the friends and relatives who died when I was young. They are eternally youthful. They're sort of fossilized in my mind.
When you're there in England, about 2 days, What kind of tricks will time play with you regarding your friend who's dead? Remembering Hampstead Heath, you're wandering around.
Yeah, and often with him.
Yes.
Well, we met when we were 11 and a half, which is nearly 49 years ago. I think it's very difficult to carry a steady sense of duration in one's mind. I think life may seem to me rather short. I don't think, especially if a life is shortened, but I don't think 50 or 60 years is that long. But I want to try and recover for him and his family the sense of a history, of what it means to have lived a life. I loved to play as a child. I think I like to play now. Hampstead Heath is a marvellous place to climb trees, to hide, to play games with others. It's a marvellous place for someone who likes plants. It's a marvellous place for its historical associations, because from Hampstead Heath you can look out on a vista which was there in Roman London. Many of my uncles and cousins were mathematicians and geologists and physical scientists. I imagined at one time that I might be such myself. I think it was a place where I had various sort of scientific fantasies. And once, when I was in Hampstead Heath, I went and knocked at the door of Julian Huxley, but he lived just by Hampstead Heath. I think he was very surprised. I was ushered in, and this dirty little, rather precocious, dirty little 12-year-old boy said, "Professor Huxley, I have some questions about evolution."
What questions?
I said I didn't see how man could have evolved so quickly by natural selection. Everything was happening too quickly. And he said, yes, that's not just nature, there's culture as well. And so, so that was pretty much the sum of the conversation.
That was everything, just...
More or less.
Culture is as important as nature. This message came around.
Yes, and that the instrument of evolution now was culture.
Was his answer satisfying?
Well, I think it was mystifying, and I think probably at that time my own interests were very much more in botany and zoology, and not terribly much to do with being human. No, my first love in science was not in biology, I think, but probably especially in chemistry. And I remember when I was 10 going to the Science Museum and seeing the periodic table up there, and seeing the families of elements. I had an overwhelming feeling of this being eternally and necessarily true. I thought that further knowledge would simply deepen the propriety of this tabulation, that this was not some artificial human tabulation, it was actually the way things were. I had a little laboratory at home. I used to sort of, amongst other things, collect the elements. I even had a strange collection of bus tickets. At that time, bus tickets used to have letters and numbers, and I would try and get the symbol for the element plus a reasonable atomic number. So if I sort of got Hg 210, this was the isotope of mercury with an atomic weight of 210. There had been a period of great disorder and distress in the war, when, with many of my generation, I was evacuated, and I think I became uncertain of everything. And science seemed to me, and the periodic table seemed to me to stand for stability and order. I think now, almost 50 years later, that this sense of order is coming back to me in a different form, and perhaps with new questions and no, not so much new questions, but maybe new answers or new formulations which wouldn't have been imaginable. I think some of the most exciting discoveries now have to do with the way in which the universe orders itself at every level, from the cosmic to the biological. And so in a way, I do partly feel I'm the same as that 10-year-old. I'm still looking for some sort of order, and but I think an order which is created autonomously and spontaneously in the universe, not one which has any sort of external, divine or Platonic archetype.
If you were me at this moment, and asking Oliver Sacks questions about his childhood, and wanted to evoke the most strongest memory at one time, so there it is, where would you start? Smells, words, asking for images, asking for odors, frequencies?
Smells, I would suspect some of one's first memories are smells. I think one might not be able to locate them in time. I always have an aching resonance when I go to farms, and I think this may have been because when I was 12 months old, and again when I was 24 months old, the family spent a month on a farm, and somehow the smells of farms seem to me the home in a very deep sense. So they seem to ground me. I think there are a lot of these things which come back. Now, just to your right, up there are a lot of ferns, and I have a passion for ferns. But then at home in London, the garden was full of ferns. Ferns were important. And in a way, it's both surprising and not surprising that these things which were so important in childhood are still important.
Yes. For instance, the smells. I remember you quoting a little poem, "They haven't got no noses, the fallen sons of Eve," or "Oh, for the happy smell of water, the brave smell of a stone."
Right.
How important the smell is, because I think that when I remember things, I'm just walking through the streets and a certain smell appears, and then suddenly the whole little universe of childhood is coming to my brain again, to my mind.
Right. Absolutely. No, I think smells have more power of resonance and evocation and association than anything else. Interestingly, this is something I'm looking at the moment and I've written about, even in people who have an amnesia and lose everything else. I think the memories of smells escape the amnesia. The memories of smells are robust neurologically. They cannot be deleted. And,
is that so?
Well, it's more so than anything else. I think one loses visual or auditory images relatively easily. But I think smells go through a very archaic part of the brain. And but interestingly, for example, with an amnesiac patient of mine whom I took out one evening, the only things which remain in his mind are the smell of pretzels and, when he got to the Grateful Dead concert, the smell of hash. These remain. So I think smells are immensely powerful. They're often associated with childhood, sometimes in the aura of a migraine or an epilepsy. There's a powerful smell. I sometimes have such an olfactory aura myself with a migraine. There's an overwhelming smell of buttered toast, of hot buttered toast. Now, the first time this happened, I was in the hospital and I went looking everywhere for this hot buttered toast. The second time it happened, I was out on the freeway. I was 100 miles from anywhere.
Couldn't be there.
I couldn't be there. And it was associated with a memory or an image of myself as a 2-year-old child about to be put on a high chair for tea. And but the smell of hot buttered toast sort of goes far back. It's one of the pieces I wrote in the Hat book is about a young man who, in a very sort of rather abnormal, probably drug-induced state, had a sudden enormous heightening and enhancement of his sense of smell. He could recognize everyone by smell. He could locate where he was in the streets by smell, and he felt himself to be in a smell world, like a dog, and he found it a world extremely vivid and full of emotion, very intense and commanding. At the same time, he found abstract thought rather difficult. And when after 3 weeks he returned to his human state, and lost this tremendous sensory heightening, and above all this heightening of smell, he felt it as both a loss and a relief. And but in general, this seems to me a sort of allegory of some of the deep biological things which I think we're in danger of forgetting or renouncing in being human.
Yes. Sometimes there is a lullaby or a certain lightful or frequency coming to your mind in a split second, and everything is there from your childhood. My question is, where is this all stored? It's a childish question. Dear Mr. Huxley, tell me, where is memory stored? Is it all there? Is every split second of our existence being stored in our brains? So tell me, Mr. Huxley.
Well, first, I don't think anything is stored in this sort of way, and I'm not sure that the notion of a store is the right one.
The brain is not a library. So.
No, I think it's not a library. It's not a granary. It's not a computer, and I think that what happens comes into the mind again always with a different context and a different construction. So I think memory is close to imagination, and I think remembering memories are constructions and not Xeroxes, not facsimiles, not reproductions.
In this sense, there's a kind of backwards projection and a kind of falsification involved. New construction of old reality.
Except I don't know whether the word falsification is reasonable, because perhaps every memory is in a context. There is no snapshot of how things are. Whatever comes into the mind always comes in a new context, and in some sense sort of coloured by the present. This doesn't mean that it's distorted, but it I think is against any sort of mechanical reproduction. One sees this very clearly, for example, in court. When there are witnesses, every witness will give you a different account. Yes. Every account is constructed. We have no way of saying what objective reality is. Everything is related to ourselves. This is our impression.
So memory is not a dead book in a library. It's living with us throughout our lives and growing up with us. Is that what you...
Yes. Although having said that, I also want to say that perhaps when we talk about cherishing memories, this may be something very different. When Goethe was 80, someone got up and made a toast to memory. And the old man got very angry, and he said, I don't recognize memory as you put it. He said one is not allowed to pine for the past, and everything significant which has happened is incorporated into oneself, and with this one grows. So memory is part of this growing, of this identity. But sometimes this doesn't occur. I've recently been seeing an artist born in a little village in Italy who is obsessed with images of this village as it was before he was 9 years old. When he was 9, the Germans came, a lot of the village was destroyed. But I want to show you something. This is, he has not seen this village in 40 years. This is a memory painting of a scene in the village, and this is a photograph taken 40 years later. Now, I think something like this is both prodigious and pathological, because here it is as if in him the unmodified memories of childhood are still very, very active and dominate him. And on the one hand,
how do you see that?
In a strange way, this man is divided. I think he hasn't quite grown into a normal, integrated being. I think there's a sort of doubleness, and that one part of him is still a child in this little village. Now, of course, he brings to the reproduction of this the technical powers and fluency of an adult and an artist. And yet I think this is the child's vision. But I'm not sure. I'm not sure whether he is a sort of genius or a sort of strange sort of casualty in a way. Perhaps he is both.
Both, yes.
Right, and perhaps,
you've seen that before.
Yeah,
it's
right.
mixed up.
And perhaps unintegrated memories of this vividness are necessary for art in some ways.
Yes.
One certainly knows that although it's complex, with someone like Joyce or Proust, the memories of childhood are woven into a theory of life and a theory of the world. Joyce always goes back to Dublin, but Dublin becomes the Dublin of Bloomsday. It finally becomes the cosmic backdrop of Finnegan's Wake. Whereas here, this little village is somehow fossilized by memory, idealized, fossilized, eternalized, and protected, as it were, from the processes of growth and becoming. It's not quite alive, or it's no longer alive, or it is only alive in a strange, sort of cherished way.
That reminds me of your writing that we have a basic feeling that we once were healthy and in harmony with the world. We once found ourselves in an Arcadian state. At some moment we lost this primeval state of innocence and bliss. And since then each of us will spend his lifetime trying to recapture this lost Arcadia. But I wondered, reading that, is this just a metaphor, or is it just this hunt for reality, although this remembrances have been distorted, not really distorted, but changed by lifetime? What is this lost Arcadia you're writing about?
That's a very good association. I hadn't made it myself when I saw this man. Perhaps we all have fantasies of paradise, of a place without sin, without lapse, without tension, possibly even without sexuality. I'm not sure about this. And a place where one is loved. This artist is at pains to say that what he draws is partly a fantasy of the village as it was in childhood, not entirely a memory, and that some of the untidiness and the distress and the dirt of reality has been removed. It's sort of cleaned up. But, of course, we would not have survived, any of us, biologically, had we not been sort of deeply loved and cared for in the first years of life. One sees this very clearly with the experiences which were recorded in an orphanage in Mexico. Spitz has described this, where the children were not loved and were given no human care, but only a certain amount of mechanical care. These children had all died by the age of 3. And it is similar even with a monkey. A monkey has to be mothered and has to be loved and cared for. And I think part of this idyllic world is to do with being loved and cared for.
Where is memory coming from? Freud talked about little children having this phylogenetic information. Mm-hmm. That is to say that the memories came back from far, far, far in history. Well, you have seen some people with phylogenetic memories. What was happening?
Well, we are certainly not born as blank tablets. We are little sort of demons, organisms, animals, creatures. We are sort of full of instincts and impulses. Something which I have seen in some of my patients has to do with the appearance of behaviors which would seem not to be taught, not to have been learned in the course of life in the ordinary way, and indeed sometimes not to be human. I described, for example, how with some of my post-encephalitic patients, when they had been put on L-Dopa, they found themselves, instead of taking a cup and drinking or even slurping like this, they would go down and they would lap from saucers. Now, I was astonished when I saw this. I'd never seen lapping activity of this sort in a human being before. And the people who showed this for themselves were astonished and somewhat mortified. They felt that something sort of primitive had taken over. There is a strange, sometimes in multiple sclerosis, if there may be a lesion in the brainstem very low down, which will cause a movement of the palate, or sometimes of the stapedius muscle in the inner ear, sometimes of these long muscles in the neck. One can't make sense of these strange symptoms until one sees that these three areas are the remnants of the gill arches, and that what one is seeing is therefore like a gill movement. But we phylogenetically, we haven't sort of been fish, we haven't had gill movements since the Jurassic. And I think it's the strangest feeling, I think, sometimes when one sees the so-called branchial myoclonus. You feel that the fish is still there within us. And I think sometimes in Tourette syndrome, the syndrome of sudden convulsive movements and things, there can also sometimes be an upsurging of very primitive memories, both onto and phylogenetic
even
primitive memories. Yeah, even I shouldn't say memories. I should say behaviors. Behaviors. That's a safer word.
Yes.
And I think things like this, as a start, make me a Darwinian. Make me feel that not only are we not blanks at birth, but really we're a billion years old. Sort of all evolution is there in some sense.
The old and the brains too.
Within us. Yeah.
Yes.
But I mean, when we yawn, I'm sure our yawning is basically similar to a dog yawning. Interesting how infectious yawning is. When one man yawns, someone else will yawn, or his dog will yawn. Or if his dog yawns, he will yawn. Or if one dog yawns, another dog yawns. But yawning is an ancient sort of pre-human. But yawning is still human, where, say, lapping and gill movement is not.
Yes, but your for instance, this post-encephalitic patients you treated with L-Dopa in Mount Carmel. You're talking about the dark side of existence you saw when you looked into their memory, their phylogenetic memories. There was the dark side of being, and you were embarrassed by what you saw. You didn't describe it really in Awakenings, but what did you see, or is language just not capable of describing it?
Yes, you're going to face me with all my footnotes from the past, with which I think I was also at pains, although I used the word dark. I think I felt dark more in the way of mysterious, and I said, and not sort of evil or Manichaean or anything like this.
This is what you call the very mixed landscape, partly familiar, partly uncanny, with sunlit uplands, bottomless chasms, volcanoes, geysers, meadows, marshes, something like Yellowstone.
Right.
That's what you're...
Yeah, I know, and I also quote Freud, who said somewhere in his notebooks that he thinks that neurosis is somewhat like a prehistoric landscape. Well, I think he says like a Jurassic landscape, and I said, well, perhaps, but I have this feeling much more strongly with some of these patients of mine.
Yeah.
I am, in a way which may be romantic or scientific or both, I'm very attracted to the primitive, and the primal. This takes different forms. It's one of the reasons I go to Australia and New Zealand, and why I want to go to Madagascar and the Galapagos. I like seeing these primitive landscapes, which are full of ferns and cycads and things which the dinosaurs might have eaten. I slightly disapprove of flowering plants and these sort of modern inventions. But I think that one of the interesting things about pathology and some clinical disorders is that it may sometimes strip off the more recent accretions so that one sees more clearly some of the primitive.
Ik citeer Darwin waar die schrijft dat de evolutie maar wat aanrommelt, zonder vooropgezet plan. Dat wij een samenraapsel zijn van wanordelijke selectie zonder enig moreel doel. Vreemde verschijningen in een natuur die gruwelijk vreed, onverschillig voor het lijden en verspillend is. Ik citeer Arthur Schopenhauer, waar die schrijft dat de mens, zodra de rechtsregels wegvallen, laat zien wie hij werkelijk is. Het meest schrikwekkende dier onder de dieren. Seks knikt instemmend bij beide citaten.
Well, with regard to the Darwin quote first, the Darwinian vision of nature, of course, is one where nature gropes and blunders and makes cul-de-sacs, and there is no steady advance upwards. There is no design in advance, and and I think this is a vision of nature which I certainly feel myself, and as a neurologist and as a clinician, I see this in human beings. We are full of sort of things, appendices without function, or pineals which have changed function. We're not very elegantly designed. Sort of, we've been improvised. We've been bits are left over, and yet this turns out itself to be very efficient, though not elegant. With regard to the Schopenhauer quote, I think we romanticize sort of the innate human being, whatever, both ways. In a way, the Schopenhauer quote is the opposite to the Rousseau quote of man as born free, but as everywhere in chains. Both of these are reasons why when wild boys, when Victor, the wild boy of Aveyron, was brought to Paris in 1800, there was such interest. The Society of Observers of Man and the Philosophe wanted to see what a native, a pure human being was like, and of course they were all wrong. He was not a sort of vile in a Schopenhauerian way, and he was not free in a Rousseau-like way. He was very, nor was he a blank in a Lockean way. He was actually very, very disabled. But certainly nature is amoral. I confess this is one of the reasons why I like nature, and one of the reasons I like nature, because it exempts me from the moral consciousness, which is sometimes such a burden.
Gould says, since nature is non-moral, is amoral, doesn't matter, this Darwinistic approach, we have to seek for morality in ourselves. And morality is not possible without the fiction, even if it's the fiction of free will. How free were we coming into this world?
Well, certainly. I just met a biologist who is, as it were, investigating the psychology of frogs, and feels he sees something almost like free will in frogs. Certainly, as behavior becomes richer and richer, I think we have more forks and more decisions which face us. I think something about some of the new theories of consciousness is that in a way they might also become theories of conscience. For example, I think with Edelman's theory, which we might discuss later, one is not seeing as fated or programmed, but life is very much a question of adventures and hazards and choices and responsibilities. Mm-hmm. I think we do have to act as though we had free will and could make responsible choices, and as though other people could do so, whether in reality these are
abstractions necessary to survive in a certain way?
I somehow want to say whether these are pure assertions of the will or the spirit, or whether they are, so to speak, the solutions which an organism will arrive at after an enormously sort of complex equation. I'm not sure. And I sometimes move one way and sometimes the other. But certainly life is has to be full of what one might call acts of will, and it is interesting sometimes to see what happens to a life if it is not marked by acts of will. This is partly, say, what Luria describes in The Mnemonist, this man with prodigious powers of imagery and memory, in which any course of action could be visualized with hallucinatory intensity and with such a sense of reality that he might not embark on it. And Luria describes his entire life as waiting for something to happen. I think sometimes there can be a similar sort of suspense or willlessness in people with Tourette's or in the Tourettic imagination, where one idea gives rise to another and another and another and another, and so there's an infinite field of ideas in which the person themselves has not been individuated and has somehow been lost. Every act of will involves a renunciation. You have to renounce what might have been.
What is the killer ape as a metaphor? How is he interfering in our all daily decisions? You understand what I mean? So there's this feeling of free will, necessary feeling of free will. Nevertheless, what is the killer ape underneath doing, disturbing?
The killer ape. Well, I don't quite know that I believe in the killer ape any more than I believe in the sort of Schopenhauerian demon. I think actually we have astonishingly little idea of what sort of basic human nature is like. I don't know that there was ever a killer ape, but any of us know as parents, even if we don't recollect as children, how willful and egocentric the child is, and how demanding and how given over to fantasy of every sort. And clearly the child has to modify, or he would become a monster, and society would disintegrate. Something which I think is very difficult to judge is sometimes how much that savage emotional intensity of childhood and that egocentric drive and will may be subjugated to higher work of the higher sort of ethical or scientific standards. the perhaps needs to be maintained of that. I think a patient for whom I found deeply bewildering and strange, but was also very fond of, is the patient whom I called Rose in the book. Now, this was a woman who had had a very acute attack of encephalitis in 1926, and in fact on the night of the attack she had dreamt that she was a statue, that she had turned to stone, that she was alive but not alive, and in the morning she was found rigid and catatonic. A mirror was put in front of her, and she sort of saw that her dreams had come true. She was kept at home for some years, and then in 1935 she came into Mount Carmel. I saw her in 1966, and like a lot of the patients, she looked much younger.
What happened in between?
Nothing, and it is the nature of the nothing which we have to look at. But basically she remained immobile with her head and her gaze averted. She could be walked a little, she could be fed. It wasn't clear how much she took in of anything around her. It wasn't clear with many of the patients until they became able to talk after they'd been given L-Dopa. Now, I hesitated very much with this particular patient. I think I say in Awakenings that I hesitated because she seemed so elsewhere and so out of the world, and I was rather haunted by something which Joyce had written about his mad daughter. Yes. When he said fervently, as I desire her cure. I wonder what then will happen if she comes out of this and faces, as he says, that battered cabman's face, the world. I hesitated with these patients to give L-Dopa for more than 2 years, partly because I did not know what might happen in them physiologically, and a lot of these patients had been extremely impulsive and excited in the early days of the epidemic, before the slow wave of lethargy and trance came over them. Von Economo, who had originally described them, spoke of them as extinct volcanoes. Mm-hmm. And I thought they might be dormant volcanoes. I didn't know what might come out. But again, I didn't know what it would mean to be replaced.
New wonders or the abyss.
Sorry?
New wonders or the abyss. You didn't know what to choose.
I didn't know what might be there. I also, all sorts of other myths. I thought of Pandora's box. And again, these were people who'd been out of the world for so long. And so it wasn't just a medical decision, but a very complex ethical and existential one. You know, what would it mean to bring them back? What then? Now, I might have stayed forever in a state of doubt. I'm somewhat given to states of doubt. Had not the patients, some of the patients died in 1968 and others had become iller, and I thought, I can't, spend forever doubting. I must give them the choice. And so some of them, or their families, elected to try L-Dopa in 1969. Now, with Rose, when she came to, she became full of animation. She walked around. She says, fabulous, it's gorgeous. She had an intense delight in movement and life, and yet her manner and her mannerisms were from a different age and were those of a much younger woman. And she spoke of Gershwin and others as if they were still alive. She had the vocabulary of the 20s. She was sort of like a flapper, come to life. And we all wondered very much, where is she? She disoriented. What's happened? And I asked her some questions, the sort of questions doctors ask. And she was a very quick woman. She said, I can tell you the dates. She said, I can tell you the date of Pearl Harbor. I can tell you the date of Kennedy's assassination. She said, these things have been registered, but none of them seem real. She said, I've been a spectator for the last 43 years.
What was real? Just the time before?
Yeah, she said, I know I'm 64, but I feel I'm 21. She says, I know it's 1969, I feel it's 1926. So, as you say, the sense of reality, nothing had seemed real since that night of the illness. And in some sense, I think nothing had been perceived in the normal way. There hadn't been the streaming of consciousness, there hadn't been change, there hadn't been growth, there hadn't been learning. In some sense, there was no memory. A few isolated things like flashbulbs, big political events, the war, and so forth, she knew.
That was all.
That was all. And so she had a formal knowledge that things had changed, but there had not in her been this slow evolution of growth and memory, which which there is, or should be at least, with all of us. I mean, in this sense, she had been fossilized or marooned in the past.
For 40 years.
For 40 years. This is something which is so difficult to imagine. People falling is through a vacuum.
What did you feel at the moment, for instance, Rose got L-Dopa?
My first feeling actually was amazement at the detail of her memories. Everything was so vivid and so clear. And at that time, we spoke earlier about a sort of a store of memories. I thought everything is there. I mean, this woman knew hundreds of songs from the 1920s. She was full of anecdotes. I mean, suddenly the 1920s were there, and her life was there as a richly alive young woman of 21. It was all neurally and psychologically there, and sort of suddenly revealed. I partly got a sense then that nothing is lost and nothing is hidden. I think at first there was a sense of wonder at a sort of miraculous, a revelation of the sort of miraculous complexity of memory in human nature. I think that after that I got a sense of fear, because what had seemed so marvelous to begin with, now, by the very freshness of its detail, seemed to me to be some terrible casualty of not being updated. And as with some of the other patients, but maybe most clearly with her, I got this terrible sense that she had been lost in time. And that her world had gone, and that maybe bringing her to our world was not the right thing to have done. And she partly said that. She said, I don't like your world.
What didn't she like?
Television. She didn't like television.
I agree.
Right? Trash, all sorts of things. She objected to the sort of plastic knives and forks in the hospital. She objected to the bad printing of newspapers. There were a lot of sort of shoddy things she didn't like about the present, but what she really said was, whatever had meaning for me has gone. She spoke of family who had abandoned her or grown old or travelled away or died. And she said, what is there for me now? And after 10 days of wondering this, she rather suddenly went back into the sort of trance-like, catatonic, rigid Parkinsonian state she'd been in for more than 40 years. And after that, neither giving her L-Dopa nor anything else sort of worked. I'm not quite sure that I would use a word like willful here. I don't think such things are within the power of the will, but I think there was a sort of a challenge to identity, which a need to create a new world and a new identity, which was impossible for her, or seemed impossible, and that this sort of perhaps led to her going back. And in a way, this was the sort of challenge which faced many of the patients. But Rose was particularly out of it. And so I think certainly the bewilderment of anachronism and this sort of tragic marooning, I think, was probably strongest with her. there were other bewilderments which, of a different sort, which I saw with some other patients, some of whom showed physiological and sometimes psychological sort of behaviors and perceptions which I would not have thought possible. Sometimes these were of the sort of pre-human, the primitive sort, which we talked about earlier. But there was another patient, for example, the one whom I call Hester, who on some occasions would not see movement continuously, but would see a series of stills. And this seemed to me, this so-called cinematic vision, I'd heard of it, perhaps in other circumstances, but that seemed to me very, very amazing indeed, especially when she described how once, when she'd seen her brother lighting his pipe, she described first seeing the match flaring up, and then successive positions of the match. And then she described how she saw the tobacco take fire in the bowl, but then the match approaching the bowl, i.e. she'd seen the lighting of the pipe a bit too soon, or else she had seen one of the approaching stages a bit too late. I didn't know how to explain that, but it bewildered me, and again made me feel that, that time must be a very complex sort of construct.
Yes. The mind, the citadel itself, the Pandora's box,
Right.
whatever you call it.
I want to say somehow I saw more with these patients, and more strangeness and more suddenly than I think I've ever seen in a sort of, in a few weeks, ever before or since. I mean, it was a revelation to me, and even now, sort of 23 years later, my mind goes back to this because it's such a richness of phenomena that I feel it can maybe illuminate all sorts of things. At first, when one gave L-Dopa to these patients, there was a response which seemed commensurate with the dose. The relation of dose and response was linear. Things were predictable. And then something happened. And the reactions and the behaviors of the patients ceased to be predictable. Patients would start to oscillate between states of excitement and states of standstill. Sometimes these oscillations were not clearly related to the times of giving the drug. I did everything I could to try and control these oscillations, and I couldn't do so. I could neither control them nor could I predict them. The Prigogine has written that the founding myth of classical science rests on predictability. And here I became bewildered and frightened because something unpredictable was happening. Something more and more complex was emerging, and I couldn't stop it. I thought I had a rather simple physiological system, pinned and fixed, and it was escaping from me. All sorts of strange new phenomena and behaviors appeared, which led me in a way which I now take back, but I see why it happened, to search for some extravagant sort of concepts outside the usual physiological ones. In particular, I wondered whether, when I saw sudden total changes in the complexion of the organism, a sudden total change which could happen in 1/100th of a second or less, sometimes from a state of Parkinsonism to a state of normality, or a state of standstill to a state of movement. I was reminded of what I had sometimes read about quantum theory, and I wondered whether one could be seeing macro-quantal events with these patients. I found myself wondering whether physiologists should bring in quantum theory and relativity theory to understand what was happening. awakenings, and for that matter, the patients themselves, were sort of full of metaphors. One patient spoke of himself as having, a very sophisticated patient, as having become a Möbius strip, he said, in which his inside became his outside, or a Klein bottle in which the inside becomes the outside. Another patient said, if only I could find the eye of my hurricane. In other words, he felt that he had become sort of a storm, unpredictable. This notion of a storm was often in my own mind. I think in retrospect that what I was seeing probably had a lot to do with what we now call the concepts of chaos, of deterministic chaos and self-organization, and the way in which nature itself is creative and brings out new forms. But these concepts were not available to me, or for that matter to anyone else, in the 1960s.
Do you also mean that brains or the mind doesn't repair itself, but it transforms into something different at some occasions? That it's possible to practice?
Well, it is not repair. It's a sort of sudden transformation, in a way which was both wonderful and terrifying. I sometimes thought of the drug and the disease and the circumstances between them playing the nervous system like an organ, pulling out stops, and unimaginable, almost unimaginable sort of physiological and psychological states and different forms of consciousness seemed to emerge. And so I think it gave me the richest feeling of neurological possibility and of the sort of immense delicacy of the nervous system, and how, in a sense, everything could be generated from within.
For you personally, wasn't it frightening?
Yeah, indeed it was, and it was both frightening and liberating, but frightening first. And I think that and frightening to others and to my colleagues, and when I wrote a letter about this, which was published in the medical literature in 1970, in which I said that first of all, things seemed predictable, and then beyond a critical point they started oscillating, and new phenomena appeared, and it became impossible to predict or control this, and that I thought we had to seek for an explanation and understanding at a much deeper level. This letter greatly annoyed several of my colleagues, and an entire issue of the journal was devoted to anger, basically I think the anger of doctors who were being told you can't control things, you can't predict it, and beyond this the anger of reason and will at things which were apparently escaping from reason and will. At a deeper level, I've said this was a liberation as well.
Yes.
And it somehow seemed to me that in a sense I was looking at nature in fast forward, that I was looking at something like evolution in fast forward, and perhaps seeing something about the adventurousness of the universe. And so what was on the one hand an insult to traditional reason and will was on the other a revelation of what might be the innovative quality of nature itself.
Can you say that these moments were the most decisive in your life? Concerning your view on life, your changing view on life?
They certainly shook me a great deal. And soon after this, I remember seeing a patient with Tourette's syndrome. And I think that in the excited state of Tourette's syndrome, I think one can see a far from equilibrium state with some similarities to the critical state of these post-encephalitic patients on L-DOPA. And I constantly saw things which I couldn't predict. And I remember writing then two essays. I wrote an essay on the odd. I wondered if the odd was a principle of nature. Previously the odd was always the exception, but then I wondered whether the odd, the variation, might in fact be crucial. and almost, as it were, the basis of a different form of nature. Prigogine, of course, likes to talk about order through fluctuation. But I didn't read Prigogine, I think, till 78 or so. When I did read him, it was with a sense of great excitement, and I thought, this is what I've been seeing in some of my patients.
And you still think that at this moment?
Yes.
Yes, there's no changement in your vision on that aspect of life.
No, I think it needs to be complemented with others. I don't know that. I don't know how much the sort of Prigogine level will extend to mental evolution. Although Prigogine himself sometimes likes to say, the universe is like a giant brain.
Yes. Well.
What?
Isn't that a little bit too much?
I'm not sure. Eddington, the astronomer, used to say that the more one looks into the universe, the less and less it's like a mechanism, and the more and more it's like a giant thought. But but at some primitive level in physiology, I think that once simplicity and linearity go, then one sees these wonderful and unpredictable and sometimes terrifying things, which you can also see in some physical systems. But so at one level, then I got this deep sense of newness coming up. In September of '69, I returned from being away to find the patients were all in tremendous trouble, and some of them had tics, and some were shaking, some were entranced. My first thought was there had been some enormous pharmacological error, that all of them had been given the wrong dose of L-Dopa. In fact, what turned out to be the case was that in my absence, the patient community had been disbanded, visiting had been forbidden, and many of the patients were in a state of great distress and helpless rage and mortification, and this was driving them into symptoms which their damaged nervous systems made possible. So here a moral event was directly sort of expressing itself in physical events. Sometimes I think one could see the opposite. I think that what one might call the moral tone, say, of Parkinsonism and of Korea, is somewhat different. I think the rigidity of Parkinsonism can sometimes produce a certain moral and intellectual rigidity, and the sort of soft, indulgent quality of Korea, a sort of moral equivalent of that. But I think above all, I had the sense of how robust identity is. And
even in the most worst circumstances, the greatest suffering.
The greatest
people
suffering.
Living for 30, 40 years in nowhere land, in the sleeping disease
Yes.
land.
In nowhere land, I mean, with a disease which tends to undermine identity, and in a situation, as you say, which would undermine it, and yet there is something so robust about identity, if it has been well formed by the time of the insult, and so that I think the resilience of these patients astonished me, and the fact that most of them were not soul murdered, as can happen in some other circumstances, like concentration camps, where indignity rather than nature has been the enemy. But I think the strength of personality and identity and character in these patients, but also the way in which this would become reorganized, but not distorted, reorganized to include their diseases and situations. This astonished me. This constantly astonishes me with all of my patients.
And when you're talking about a new kind of tenderness you discovered, word tenderness. What does that mean concerning the L-DOPA patients, post-encephalitic patients? Because you're writing about them with so much tenderness.
No. Well, as you say, they became friends in a way, and teachers. They became my children. They became my parents. Although I hope I didn't sacrifice some sense of objectivity and detachment, yet I think the sort of feeling of empathy and imagining myself into their worlds, had to be very, very central there. And this may be partly the romantic impulse again, but it may partly be what science has to be when it's at the human level. I think it's the nature of human nature and maybe animal nature to search for meanings. A recent book was written by Jerome Bruner called Acts of Meaning. I think human life is determined by the search for meaning or the creation of meaning or of different meanings. I think that the
Do you want to say also that once we find the meaning of life, everything would become useless, a standstill, dead end street?
No, I wouldn't say that. And first, I'm not sure what could possibly be meant by the meaning of life. But for example, one form of the search for meaning is making theories. And the question arises as to whether there is an end to theorizing. Now, I think Stephen Hawking, for example, will suggest that there is an end to theorizing, yes, and that sooner or later we will get a TOE, a theory of everything. And
that fits on a T-shirt, so unified formula here.
Right, and with this, the scientific enterprise will come to an end. I prefer not to think that this is so, and certainly in my own minor way, whenever any solution has become apparent to me, it in turn has opened a new realm of questions which was broader than anything I could have asked before. So if anything, it seems to me that the realm of questioning and theorizing and inquiry gets larger and larger, even though sort of deep unifying cores appear within it. With regard to, now it might be argued that though that the physical universe is finite and there is a limit to theorizing about it, but not to the biological or the mental universe, which is continually evolving. And I think that the very form of theories about the brain may have to be quite different from some physical theories. Edelman likes to say that that as we had the Galilean revolution 400 years ago, we may now need a new sort of revolution, which is quite comparable to this, to produce, if you want, a science of the subjective, and a science of the unique and the individual, and a science of consciousness. And I think I go along with this. And one of the reasons I'm sort of against mechanical models is that they are too physicalistic and too reductive and too impoverished and too boring. And I think they break down hopelessly, finally, before the sheer creativity of the brain. Something which has intrigued me increasingly has to do always with the appearance of the new, with the emergence of apparently unexpected thoughts or images or patterns into consciousness, for which there is no precedent and no program. Now, I'm not entirely at home talking about language and consciousness. I always want to bring things down to a simpler level or a more elemental level. And one of the things which has fascinated me for many years has been the visual hallucinations, and specifically the geometrical hallucinations, which one may get preceding an attack of migraine, the so-called migraine aura. I don't know if you have such attacks yourself. Do
Yes.
you? What,
Too often.
what do you see?
Well, half a circle, growing to finally near a circle.
Something like that.
Yes.
Right.
For
And
instance.
and the circle itself may have some sort of internal structure, the semicircle,
Yes, it's
with lines
flickering
and
and
zigzags
lines and
it also
zigzags and all the
flickers.
kind of things.
Right.
Yes.
Okay. Now I think beyond these rather fixed forms of the expanding circle with its flickering zigzags, I think one can have very complex, unpredictable things. I think sometimes you may have half the image here giving you these strange crescentic whirls and things, or here, half the image you have spirals and radial figures. And here the whole visual field has been turned over to these sort of strange forms. Or you may have something like a tunnel there, or everything, you may have a world reduced to these sort of scrolls and things. And sometimes you may get lattices like this, and lattices which constantly fluctuate
Well,
in
that's rather
shape
familiar to me.
and
this,
size.
yeah.
Right.
Yes.
Now, why I bring these things up is that although the fixed scintillating semicircle is something which is rather predictable, it takes about 20 minutes to evolve.
Yes.
It always has the same form. These things never have the same form. These later things, they are different in every person, they are different in every attack. Although there are certain features like the lattices and the spirals which can come up again and again. And here, it's very interesting, in the 1850s, the astronomer Herschel described these things in himself. And he wondered what produced these geometrical spectres, as he called them. He wondered if it could be a thought, an intelligence, distinct from that of the personality. Or on the other hand, he wondered if it could be, as he called it, a kind of kaleidoscope, or kaleidoscopic power in the brain. What's interesting is already here you have a sort of dualism. He's saying, are these produced by an agent, a thought, a spirit, or by a device? Now, in fact, I don't think they're produced by either. I think that these patterns are spontaneously generated. I think they evolve through the cortex. I think there's a self-organization going on. Interestingly, I think one can mimic this somewhat. These are some things I've been doing with a colleague of mine, Ralph Siegel, with nerve nets. And if the nerve net is pushed past critical, it develops a migraine, as it were. It starts to develop these strange structures. So I think what I'm saying once more, this comes back to sort of nature and nurture. It's things don't have to be built in, and they don't have to come from the outside. I think it is the power of the autonomous and the spontaneous and the creative, which is the most striking thing in the human brain, and not only at the level of what we usually call creativity, but even at the level of primary visual cortex. When we are awake, this autonomous activity of the mind and the brain is constrained by our perceptions and reality, social constraints. When we are asleep, it's not, and we can then have the freedom and the license of dreaming, though I think it could be said reasonably that we are dreaming all the while. Except when we are awake, the dreams are constrained by reality. I think these strange geometrical patterns I showed you are the dreaming of the visual cortex. I think Parkinsonism is like a dream of the midbrain. I think in some sense there is some autonomous activity we see everywhere in nature, which is as if the world itself is dreaming. Machinery is inert. You have to press a button or pull a lever to start it. The world is not inert. There is nothing inert in the world except some of the devices which we make in it. Activity is built into the world. Aristotle said this. He called it energia. And Aristotle also thought that however much human beings delighted in proposing and solving problems, the real delight of the mind was in its own activity. And it is the nature of activity which seems to me to be inexplicable in mechanical terms, and which demands the creatural terms and the terms of animals. Many years ago, I got very excited by Leibniz and his saying, his equating existence with activity. It partly seems to me in the Leibnizian view of the world, everything is active and autonomous. And this is different from the Newtonian view of the world, or the Galilean view, in which objects stay in a state of rest unless they are impressed by an impulse, and then they roll inertly down an inclined plane. And when the energy is used, it's gone. There is a continual transfer of energy and reorganization of energy and activity in living creatures, and especially in human brains. And at the highest level, this sort of continual transfer, I think, is what Prigogine is concerned with at a lower level, in what he calls self-organization, and what Edelman is concerned with at the highest level, with his notions of recategorization and re-entrance. It's going on all the time. It never stops.
We are such stuff as dreams are made of, and our little lives are rounded with a sleep. Shakespeare, this is the motto for the narrative.
Absolutely, yeah. No.
Awake or asleep, the dream.
Right, I think we dream non-stop until we come to the sleep at the end.
You want to say something, Mike? Okay. So you see that the points that we're bringing out is pertinent. This is not a joke. A lot of you walk by, and your first impression of us is that, oh, they're a bunch of angry black men that's out here that have nothing better to do. They're mad with society. They're frustrated. They're angry, and they just want to blow up a little steam and say derogatory, negative statements about whites. But when you stand here for a little while and get an ear full of this, you begin to realize that what we're saying is very important, is significant, is paramount, and it's going to affect your lives, white man. What's written in this Bible, you thought it was a joke. That's why you made Easter and Santa Claus and bunnies lays eggs, and you taught those fallacies to your children. And then when your children grow up, they take out a gun and blow your brains out for teaching them these lies. You tell your children not to lie, yet you lie to them.
It's gonna be a long time before I finish one of the many missions that I have to establish. To make this blade ignite your weapon sights, and if you ain't down, bullshit. Say stop work, trying to get you pull your idol. Once you go to one time, play the role model. No, I think you play like a fraud. Next year, the shot of a magnum slug. I'm man coming at ya. Yeah, you know I'm gonna get ya. How do you know where I'm at when you haven't been where I've been? Understand where I'm coming from when you're up on the hill and you're big home. I'm out here